Hello, I'm Lorraine Decter, and we're here to have a very serious talk this evening, and we hope you'll join us. A very important conversation that we're going to have about sexual assault, sexual harassment. What is the difference? How do you protect yourself? How do you protect others that you care about and love? And how is it different at home or in the workplace? According to statistics, the Bureau of Justice says over 43,000 workplace rapes and sexual assaults each year. And of course, that has come to the headlines very much recently in terms of the Me Too movement and several other issues that have come out in the workplace. So I want to talk to our guests and tell you who we have here. You can participate by calling in your questions or by sending them in via Facebook. Eric Hereford is the Trinity County District Attorney. Thanks so much for being here.
Fine.
Also from Trinity County, we have Randy Robertson, and you're from Trindell Insurance, and you offer expertise in human resources and training, but not just in Trinity County, in several counties, correct?
Correct. 11 counties across Northern California.
11 counties. Julie Hunter is here, and she is in charge of outreach and a counselor at Rape Crisis Intervention, and you cover 3 different counties.
True, Tehama, Butte, and Glenn counties.
This is going to be a very important conversation. I know this hour is going to go very, very quickly. But one of the things we need to do first, I think, is to establish what the difference is between sexual harassment and sexual assault. So I think we'll start with you, Randy.
So sexual harassment in the workplace is clearly defined by law. So there's federal law and there's state law. You know, sexual harassment falls into 2 basic categories: quid pro quo. Quid pro quo is that very classic thing that we're seeing in the news, where it's, if you give me sex, then you get to keep your job. If you go out with me, you have drinks with me. It's that very classic kind of thing. Sexual harassment in the workplace, typically where there's a power difference, where you have a manager or a supervisor and a new employee or somebody who doesn't have the same level of power. So sexual harassment, it's around that whole this for that kind of thing. And then there's the more common form of sexual harassment is hostile work environment. Hostile work environment is those issues where perhaps it's inappropriate pictures, phone calls, inappropriate touching, sexting, so using that cell phone inappropriately. So it's those environments that we're looking at in the workplace. And then you go, when it's touching, it's groping, when it's not welcome conduct, then we're crossing the line from simple sexual harassment more than into the legal side of it rather than just the employment law side.
But what if somebody's at work as a hugger? Is that a problem?
So it can be, yes. Hugging, for the most part, just shouldn't belong in the workplace. Everybody needs to know and understand boundaries. Can there be consent between 2 adults to, say, hug in the workplace? There can be, but a hug in the workplace between 2 consenting adults can also make a third party quite uncomfortable. And that third party can then file a complaint. So within the workplace, employers need to make sure they have good policies, good practices, that they're training people, and then hold people accountable for the behaviors. So it's not as black and white as the quid pro quo, where there's definitely a power difference and sex for keeping your job. So there's a lot of subtleties and there's a lot of gray areas. I'd love to say it's always very clear, it's always cut and dry, but not always so in the workplace.
Yeah, it sounds like it can be very difficult to sort out for people.
Absolutely.
And so if you're an employee, not an employer, it sounds like you should be asking if there's a policy, if you're concerned.
Correct, absolutely. Virtually every employer, no matter the size, whether you've got 1 employee or if you've got 5,000, every employer should have a clear policy. They're available through the state of California. The federal government has policy samples that are available for free. But every employer should have a very clear policy about what's acceptable, what goes in the workplace, what doesn't, and then most importantly, how do you enforce it and how do you report it? You know, the unfortunate side of sexual harassment in the workplace, only 1 out of 4 sexual harassment cases ever get reported, and it can be even less than that. So unless an employer is creating an environment where it's okay to report, it's okay to talk, that there's no retaliation happening for the person who reports sexual harassment. So it's just very critical to have good policies, good training, good practices, and employers practice zero tolerance, and that's a whole other discussion to have. But practicing zero tolerance, which means enforcing, which means there's a consequence for the bad behavior.
So let's talk about sexual assault, because that's could happen in a workplace, but perhaps we're talking about a different environment. So as district attorney in Trinity County, maybe you could address that.
Sure, Lorraine. Typically, sexual assault would be defined as any unlawful or unwanted physical touching that's done for sexual gratification. And that could range from kind of a misdemeanor level groping action, like a sexual battery, where you're touching someone inappropriately for your own sexual gratification, to forcible rape. There's a big range there.
So there's such a big range. How do you know what is criminal and what is not? And how do you know when to report it?
Well, it's almost, whenever you don't have consent, that's typically going to be criminal. If you're a victim of sexual assault, there's no wrong time to report it, but the earlier the better is usually the best course.
So I guess it may be important for people to define exactly what consent is.
And typically, consent is, the best consent is explicit when someone says, yes, I want to do that with you. Mm-hmm. It can be kind of an implicit, a lot of times if people are comfortable in a relationship, it doesn't require the formality of yes. But on the other hand, no always means no. And if someone says no, any conduct should stop at that point.
So can you change your mind? Is this a confusing part of this sexual assault because somebody says yes and then at some point they say no?
No. If someone says, kind of gives consent initially, but things change, they can withdraw that consent at any time. So if things aren't going the way they want, they can say, no, I don't want to do that. And anything, if that act were to continue, that would be a sexual assault.
So we're wondering if men are very often victims or perpetrators, or the females, victims or perpetrators. Who is the most? How does this split up? And I think from Rape Crisis Intervention and Prevention, we'll talk to Julie Hunter about that.
So most often it's going to be a female will be the victim, but it's not always that way. We have male victims as well. We call them survivors. And females can also be perpetrators. So we need to be careful about boxing people into those, who's going to be the survivor, who's going to be the perpetrator, but yet is most often females are the targets. We live in a rape crisis. We live in a rape culture, unfortunately.
Why do you say that?
Why do I say that? Because it's true. I can tell you, I know a man who has 3 children, and he bought one of them a stun gun. You can, just by that, you can tell me how many boys and how many girls he has. He bought his daughter a stun gun. He didn't buy it for his boys. They didn't need it. We teach our daughters, don't do this, don't say this, don't wear this, don't go to this place, don't go out by yourself. We teach our daughters these things. We don't teach these to our sons. We teach our daughters don't get raped, but we don't teach our sons don't rape.
Interesting. So there are a lot of things perhaps we need to teach when our children are younger. What do you think? Boundaries
all the way around for everybody involved. Teaching children to be assertive. Your body belongs to you, doesn't belong to anybody else. I believe it needs to start at a young age, but we need to not stop giving that message to people at any time.
Do you think that would make a difference?
Yeah, and I think earlier we were talking boundaries and respect. I think
Yes.
are the 2 words.
Those are key.
That you want to teach young people.
And is it different, say, in a real small community, say in a remote area like Trinity County or Siskiyou or Modoc County versus our larger communities, Chico, Reading? Is there a difference in?
There shouldn't be. Those same values should apply regardless of where you live.
Yeah, it really knows no boundaries what we're talking about tonight, whether it's a small community or a very large city, a small company.
But there are
large
worse
one.
rates in a smaller community versus, is there any noticeable difference? You've been in college for this for a while, so
Yeah.
you must know all the latest.
Unfortunately, our local statistics. If people are going to start looking up stats, just even in Red Bluff alone, we had 30 rapes that were reported last year. We had 21 reported the year before. Before that, the numbers were only maybe 6 to 9 a year. But part of that is because the laws changed of what even defined rape. So that was part of it. Part of it is the fact that we are trying to make our society more aware of what is happening. It's not that it's new, it's just that we're trying to make people more aware of what's going on. And so people are more comfortable with it as opposed to maybe years prior. So the numbers, as people start looking at statistics, the numbers are going to be higher than they were before. And as unfortunately, even in our local area, 1 in 3 girls are going to be sexually assaulted before they turn 18. 1 in 4 boys will be sexually assaulted before they turn 18, but on a national level, it'll be 1 in 4 girls and 1 in 6 boys. So we do seem to have a higher problem in our area.
Any reasons why? Is it speculated when you're learning about this stuff? No?
It would be only speculation.
Interesting. So I'm curious about where the majority of these offenses might occur. Is it something that we see more in the home or more in the workplace or more in school or other locations?
Again, it's going to be if it's sexual assault or sexual harassment. Sexual assault will be happening more in the home, I think.
Yeah.
Unfortunately, because it's more with somebody that you know, somebody that you're close to, as opposed to sexual harassment in the workplace.
Yeah, and sexual harassment in the workplace, it kind of knows no boundaries. It can be boss-subordinate role, it can be coworkers, but it's typically people that you're with that you know, where boundaries get crossed, signals are not understood, and then managers, supervisors don't do the enforcement side of it. They don't do the training, they don't do the education, and people are subjected to really bad and inappropriate behaviors in the workplace. It's about boundaries. And the other part of it when we were talking about is also teaching not to objectify people. When people become an object, then there's that feeling of ownership. And I don't know how many times I've heard that in my career in doing investigations, is it becomes very apparent that that person is seen as an object rather than as a person, as a coworker. And that so often leads to problems, that objectification. And so if we can teach kids not to think of that person, that little girl, that little boy as an object, we're going to be better off.
Our phone number is 243-5493 if you'd like to call in and ask any questions of our panel here. We have Eric Hereford, who is the Trinity County District Attorney. We have Randy Robertson, Human Resources Expert from Trindle Insurance, and Julie Hunter, Rape Crisis Intervention and Prevention, and she is in charge of outreach, and she's also a counselor there. So go ahead, give us a call, 243-5493. So we've been talking about some of these fine lines. Is it confusing for people to know if they're doing something wrong or not? Is it, some people say, is it ignorance or is it malicious behavior? Is it, is it okay to give a compliment or is it not? People are sometimes insecure about what is okay nowadays.
In the workplace, it should be clear. Can you still give a compliment at work? Sure, you can still give a compliment at work. But when you give the compliment that is more like, boy, you look really good in those tight pants, that's not appropriate. But now if you can say, really nice fabric or something like that, or that's a different color, whatever, yes. But as soon as you start saying things about shape, about the design, about you look really hot in that, and it's not July in Reading, well, then you've got a problem. So yeah, you can still give a compliment about a nice haircut and that's okay, but it's crossing the line when then there's something attached to that. Go out with me, have a date, how about a hug? It's that kind of thing, and that's where employers have to make sure they're training their people, setting boundaries, and also, again, making sure that it's okay for that person who's the subject of the bad behavior to stand up and say no.
You know, PBS just came out with a show today on the NewsHour that was talking about the Forest Service, and that's a very big employer here in Northern California, and how the firefighting crews had what they would probably call a pervasive kind of situation where people were sexually harassed in the workplace. Do people, well, they must have a policy. We did ask the Shasta Trinity National Forest to make a comment here on what's going on in their forest in Northern California to address that, but they were told they weren't allowed to give a statement just for their forest because this is a national issue. But, you know, when is it too late to report this? And when you have a big organization, that's our federal government, with a policy in place and, you know, phone lines and tip lines, how do we go through if we know what's right and know what's wrong, but if we're afraid we might lose our job, you know, what do we do?
So retaliation is certainly a big issue. But you know, earlier I mentioned policy. Policies are wonderful, but they are just a piece of paper and they're just words. Policy has to be combined with enforcement and action by the employer. There has to be accountability. There has to be consequences. You know, and looking at that situation with the Forest Service, it was, to me, it was very clear failure of management, very clear failure of leadership to set limits, to hold what appeared to be mostly men who were the perpetrators of sexual assault, sexual harassment, a hostile workplace. It's a failure of management to hold people accountable and enforce their own policies. Unfortunately, there still is a bit of a good old boys network that exists, and they tend to want to sweep it under the table and not hold the person that we've worked with, the guy that they've worked with for 20 years, accountable. So it's a real problem. And I will say, I think public sector, like the Forest Service, the Park Service, some of those organizations are behind the curve. I think private sector has been dealing with this more effectively longer. Public sector, in some cases, has a long way to go.
Well, you know, I just got to say, you know, like Me Too, we have to, you know, look back in our histories and how we raise our children and how we earn our past. And I know in my 20s, I was working in a men's field primarily, and you would be afraid to lose your job if you brought up anything. You were lucky to have that job.
Sure.
And it seems like that's what I'm reading in this thing about the Forest Service. And in terms of women in the military as well, and what's going on with that.
Yeah, and I haven't seen the Forest Service report frame, but and I think it's another area we need to distinguish whether it was sexual harassment in the workplace or if there were actually sexual assaults going on within the work area.
There were both.
And if it involves
Because then you
sexual
can have
assaults,
criminal inside the
exactly,
workplace, you can have both.
Then you have the potential for criminal prosecution and sanctions. That's one area where in sexual assault, you know, typically there's a statute of limitations where people have to report a crime and it has to be addressed within a time period. Sexual assault, they've extended the statute of limitations, so if they were to report that they were sexually assaulted, that could still be prosecuted.
So we did get a question from Dunsmuir, someone in Dunsmuir who asked, what is the statute of limitations on rape?
Usually it's 3 years, but it can be from the date of reporting. So we can go a ways back.
When does, this is from Chico Dolores, when does workplace harassment become prosecutable?
Typically, harassment in the workplace is going to be a civil violation, and that'd be the remedy, where the employer's civilly liable, co-workers, supervisors. You have to cross the line from harassment isn't going to be criminal typically. You have to have some kind of physical act for it to cross the line to become criminal.
Our phone number again is 243-5493. You can give us a call if you have a question for our panel. Bobby from Reading called and said, do the same laws apply to Indian reservations?
Yeah, I
That's
don't know
for
if
you, Eric.
Okay,
Yeah,
I didn't know
you
if she
want
was
that one
talking
to-
criminally or civilly.
I would think,
Yeah, I would say
well, maybe
yes.
both,
yeah.
I guess, huh?
Yeah, and some of the reservations, they'll have tribal jurisdiction, but state law would apply as well. So if you commit a rape in an Indian jurisdiction, that could be prosecutable within that county as well.
so if something happens in the workplace, and if it's sexual assault or sexual harassment, whichever it is, what are you supposed to do? And is it different if you're not in the workplace? Do you go through the same steps if this happens to you, no matter what situation you're in?
So yeah, so if there's a sexual assault between, say, coworkers, is that?
Any kind.
Yeah, that needs to get reported to law enforcement. It'd be the first step that someone needs to do.
If it happens outside the workplace, unless it's really a serious assault.
Yeah, I think that needs to be reported to law enforcement. And there could be workplace issues as well that would be addressed, but the criminal case is going to have priority. That's
So what do they need to prove it?
a lot of it will
Before they walk in and go to report to somewhere, what do
Well-
they need to have with them?
And it's really not on the victim to figure that out. If they were a victim, they just need to go and tell someone, and at some point, law enforcement becomes involved about what happened, that they were assaulted, kind of the details, when, where, and then let law enforcement investigate it.
We've had people ask us, because we were doing this show, do you go to the police station, the sheriff's office, do you go to the
Right.
Hospital.
where do you go?
I think that you can go to any of those places. The important thing is you need to go somewhere. You can report it to a crisis center.
Right. What I see at Rape Crisis is a lot of people will go talk to their friends or family first, and it's their family and friends who will support them and say, you need to report this, and we'll talk them into coming in and reporting. And either they call Rape Crisis directly, or they will go to the police or call the police, or they will go to an ER. You can do any of those things. Any of those things will get you to where you need to be, because we're set up where we have a SART team, a sexual assault response team, and we will contact each other, and we will get all of our people.
And every county has that.
Should have it in place. Yes, should have it in place. And we get together and we will meet, and ideally we try to meet with the person all at the same time. Tehama is really good about this. At Tehama County, we will try to all meet at the same time so that we can talk to the person all at once, because when that person has to come in and report what has been done to them, it's like being sexually assaulted all over again, because they're having to relive it and tell it. And so we try to be all together. And so they can go to any of the agencies and call any of them.
And I
we'll
think,
make sure- yeah.
I'm sorry. to
No,
interrupt.
go ahead.
I think that's one thing victims need to know is when they report, there's going to be a lot of support available for them.
Yes. There's a
right
lot of
from the
resources,
beginning.
yes.
They're not just going to be stuck with a law enforcement officer. There's going to be victim support people.
Something else I need to say. They also have the option of not talking to law enforcement.
true.
And that's huge, that they need to know this, because a lot of them will be afraid to say, I don't want to tell on my dad. I don't want to tell on my uncle. I don't want to tell on the neighbor. I don't want to tell on the family friend. And so these people are afraid. They're very afraid. They've been, some of them have been threatened. It's not uncommon that the perpetrator will threaten to come back and kill them. The perpetrator will threaten to kill them and all the females in their family. It's all about power. It's all about power, and these people are afraid. And so that is one of the options. We tell them, you do not have to talk to law enforcement. And that may seem like not the way to go. It's like, no, we want to get these people caught. But what we need to do is put power back into the person who's been assaulted and let them know they are in charge of their life. And that is super important for getting them back on the road to recovery as fast as possible.
I know a family has just gone through something like
Yes.
this, and I know the husband really wanted to say, you have to go report this, and kind of was waiting and luckily waiting, and the woman
Yes.
decided on her own. And they were talking about how that is so important.
It is
because
important, right.
that getting to that point where you do make your own step, not because you're told to, but because it's the
Right.
right thing to do.
Well, we want to say it's the right thing to do because on the outside, but looking in, they have to make that decision for themselves. But on the other hand, what part of my job is to keep them informed, is to let them know: do you want to go through with the SART exam? Do you want this exam where they pull all the evidence off your body looking for DNA? That needs to be done within a certain amount of time. Usually, they try to have it done within 72 hours. Don't shower, don't change your clothes. Just go. If you do want to have this exam, go straight to the ER and get it done. If you do wait a day or two, you can still come in and you can still get some evidence off of them.
And like Julie was saying, they don't have to talk to law enforcement, but at least then the evidence is preserved.
Yes.
So
goes
later
to the
on, if
crime
they
lab.
change their mind, that evidence has been gathered and we
Yes.
can use it later on.
Yes, and sometimes somebody will say, I don't want to talk to law enforcement. They'll start the exam and then they'll change their mind and say, yes, I do want to talk to law enforcement. So it's important that they have that choice themselves.
But that's, one end of the extreme, but then there are probably a lot of cases where there's no proof. So people are probably maybe a little more insecure about going and reporting something when it's after the fact, there's no proof. So that's the source of my question. Like, when you don't, what do you have to go forward? You have your story, but is there something else you need if you're going to be seriously?
Not necessarily.
Pushing.
I mean,
Not
we'll
necessarily.
prosecute cases based on a victim's statement. Now, obviously, it's a lot better if we have corroborating physical evidence, but you don't always have that.
What about the right of the accused? Here's Bob from Fort Jones who says, what are a man's right or rights when accused of harassment or assault? Which would be really a man or a woman's rights when accused of harassment or
Same
assault. So what
rights.
are their rights?
So on the employment law side of it, California says there has to be due process. So when a man is accused of sexual harassment in the workplace, there needs to be a good faith investigation. There needs to be an investigation plan. It needs to be done in a timely manner. You talk to the victim, you talk to the person who's accused, you look for witnesses. So in many ways, then the investigation side of it is similar to law enforcement. Is there's effective due process. You have to be able to do a good, fair, thorough, independent investigation. A critical piece of that investigation is having someone who's doing the investigation who doesn't have that vested interest in the outcome. It can't be the supervisor or the manager of the male who's being accused. So it can't be the direct
So do businesses
relationship.
hire someone to come in and do an investigation?
Yes, so and they can't. HR departments internal can do them, but if you go outside in California, then it has to be an attorney or it has to be a certified licensed investigator. So that's the only options. It can be an internal source, HR, who's trained, or an attorney or a licensed investigator.
So we want to give our phone number again, 243-5493. This is KIXC TV. This is North State Issues. And we are talking about sexual harassment and assault, kind of a scope of things, and trying to find out what the rules are, what the laws are, what consent is, what the issues are. And with us in the studio here we have Eric Hereford, who is District Attorney from Trinity County. We have Randy Robertson, who is a human resources expert from Trindle Insurance, and Julie Hunter is here, and she is from Rape Crisis Intervention and Prevention from 3 different counties, Tehama, Glenn, and Butte. She's a counselor, and she's also in charge of outreach. So if you have questions for our panel, go ahead and give us a call, 243-5493, and you can also put a question on our Facebook page if you'd like to get it to our panel. We have Michelle of Red Bluff who says, if I go to the hospital because of rape, doesn't the hospital have to report the crime? Do you know that?
Does the hospital have to report the, if the I'm not sure if the hospital themselves have to report the crime. They may call law enforcement in, but that does not mean that the person that walks in has to talk to law enforcement. Law enforcement's going to be the one who's going to transport the kid. They actually are paying for the SART kits. They're paying for that to be done. It's free as far as the survivor walking in. So there may be different.
They may be required to report it to law enforcement,
Right.
but that doesn't mean that the victim has to
Thank
give
you,
a
yes.
statement. Or,
Is there a point that a business has to report to law enforcement that something like that has happened in their business?
Well, certainly if there's sexual assault, and again, there's a difference between sexual harassment, what we've talked about, but certainly battery, inappropriate touching, groping that we've talked about, then that's crossed the line. My experience is it has been rare for employers to call law enforcement. I think it's one of the weaknesses that employers have in this whole process. Rape, severe sexual assault, it's a difficult question, should always be reported. My experience has been is employers are reluctant to do it. They put the burden then on the person, the victim of the sexual assault, rather than the employer taking the lead.
How long have you been doing this in different businesses here?
30 plus years.
30 plus years. What have you seen change over those 30 years in terms of what's happening in the workplace?
Certainly more awareness about what's right and what's wrong. When I first started doing this training many years ago, the reports were significant. You saw an awful lot of reports of sexual harassment in the workplace. Over the last 20 years, what I have seen is as we have trained, as we've made people aware, as we've enforced our policies and practices, we've seen the number of cases of sexual harassment in the workplace go down, and that's a good thing. We've definitely seen a change in it. What we're also seeing now, because of the hashtag #MeToo movement, I think we're seeing people who wouldn't necessarily report stepping forward now. It is a very courageous thing to step forward and say, this has happened to me in the workplace, because there's a lot of downside for women, and in some cases men, but mostly women, to report. So we've seen it go down. From an HR perspective, if you don't tell me, I can't fix it. So we always encourage people, report it, let your supervisor know, let HR know, call the EEOC, the Equal Employment Opportunity Commission, call the state of California, because if we don't know, again, we can't fix it.
So let's get real exact here. So if something bothers someone at work and they feel it's some kind of sexual harassment, they have to tell somebody that it bothers them before someone can be told that's not appropriate, and then they could be punished for it or reprimanded.
Sure.
Or whatever that is. What do you suggest to businesses on how that process should go?
The first thing that a business really needs to do is make sure that it's okay for the employee to say no to the person who's acting inappropriately, and that they will be supported by saying no. So that's the first thing that employers really need to work on. It's okay to say no, and we're going to support you in saying no. If that does not work, if the behavior does not stop, then they need to go to their supervisor, and the supervisor needs to talk to HR, needs to talk to the manager. Whatever it is, to first take any appropriate action to get the behavior to stop. So you've got to go, the supervisor has to go to the person being accused and say, cease, desist, there's an investigation, we will find out what's happened, but the person has to be put on notice, you have to stop. So employers really have to have a clear, bright line, and we do training around knowing where the line is. And so employers have to train employees not to cross that line. If you do cross the line, there has to be consequences to that.
And how do you sort out when it's kind of a he said, she said thing and you don't have maybe any evidence or witnesses? How do you deal with this in the workplace and in the courts, in the legal system?
That's for you.
We deal with those kinds of cases all the time where someone, may not initially make a report, and like Julia was saying, you're past that 48, 72-hour time period to collect physical evidence, but we'll still have law enforcement investigate them. Then you start looking for corroborating evidence, whether it's other people, physical evidence in a bedroom, descriptions, those kinds of things.
An investigation.
Exactly. You investigate it and you put the best case you can together. So, and we have a lot of cases where, we'll just have the testimony of the victim. And, one of the common arguments we make is, why would someone make this up? It's like Julie was kind of talking earlier about, you're asking someone to talk about the most intimate details of a life, about the worst thing they've experienced, and why is someone going to make that up and put themselves through that whole process and talk about it in front of strangers?
And over the course of my career, I've investigated, unfortunately, hundreds of these cases. I've only had one case in my career where it was a false accusation. One out of hundreds. People just, it's a very traumatic thing to report it. And unless there's an awful lot of truth behind it, people tend not to step forward. So it's a very difficult one. So as employers, we've got to make sure we're setting that environment where it's okay to come to us, and then there'll be no retaliation for doing that reporting.
I'd like to add to that, in a home environment, especially with younger people, sometimes they don't know what to call what happened to them. They don't have a name for it. Young children often, I know of one who said she thought she'd been raped. It turned out it wasn't rape, but that's what she said because that's what she thought. But she wasn't trying to get somebody into more trouble than what they had already done. She didn't have the word for it. And when you're watching these people, if you've ever watched somebody try to tell you, explain a sexual assault that's happened to them, there's just certain words, certain body movements that they have that you just know. You just know that they're not making this up. They're telling the truth because of the wording that they use, the way they describe it, the way that they physically will remove themselves from it, and all of a sudden they just break down in tears when they realize what they're even saying. They have to take a moment, and it's nothing that they can fake. You can tell the difference.
And I would agree, what people do is they don't know the words. Even adults in employment situations, they really don't know the word. What they do is they tell you the story.
Yep.
They give you, here's what happened to me, and I don't know why, I don't know what it is, but here's what's happened. And then it's up to the employer to figure that out.
Our phone number again, 243-5493. We're talking about sexual assault and harassment in the workplace and without, and what has changed over the years and what is important to know. We have Ray in Reading from Facebook said, what is in place to protect the victim? Considering it's usually a he said, she said, this causes people to fear coming forward. And someone else had asked about the services Rape Crisis Center and Prevention offer. So let's talk a little bit about what kind of protections victims have. Are they protected from losing their jobs if they're in a workplace and they report harassment? Is there a protection?
So yes, there is. It's both at the federal level and state of California retaliation. The person who reports sexual harassment or the assault in the workplace is protected from retaliation by the employer. So you can't be disciplined. You cannot be disciplined, fired, terminated.
Now, is this just a business that's over a certain number of people, or is it a small business, any business?
If you have one employee, then the law comes into play. So you cannot be retaliated against. Now, it doesn't mean it doesn't happen. It does. Retaliation in employment law is the single biggest growing sector in this whole discrimination field because employers do not protect the right of that employee to step forward. So certainly there's retaliation law, and with retaliation and with sexual harassment, we talked about it earlier, there's personal liability for the employer, there's personal liability for the supervisor, personal liability for the coworker who participates in this kind of behavior. So while difficult as it is, there are protections in place. It doesn't mean there isn't going to be pain, doesn't mean there isn't going to be very difficult days, and the need for the support like you offer, no matter what happens, whether it's in the workplace, at a party, after hours, at home. Support is so critical for victims.
Yes.
Here's a question. We just have several that have come in. What do I do if I think I'm being harassed at work? Instructions. We're looking for the instructions here.
So what do you do? First, know and understand your policy if your employer has a policy. Employers should. That doesn't mean that they do. The next thing, if there is no policy in place, then call the Department of Fair Employment and Housing, state of California. You go to their website, dfeh.com, and they will answer any questions. They'll take a report. You can call the Equal Employment Opportunity Commission. But I always recommend start with your employer, start with your supervisor. Know and understand your policy, your reporting process. Because in California, if you have a policy, you have to have a reporting procedure in place and the rule against retaliation. So start with your employer first.
Okay, and so if it's a he said, she said situation in which the harassment is not physical assault with no evidence, what would you say to those afraid to come forward?
It's very, we were talking about investigations. So the employer has that affirmative responsibility to do an investigation. My experience from all of these years of doing HR work, rarely is there just a he said, she said. My experience has been there's always someone who knows something, but they're not stepping forward. So it means really talking to the person who's been subjected to the bad behavior. Who have they talked to? What coworkers? There's always someone who knows something, but the investigator, the employer's got to be willing to do the hard work.
And Julie, from Rape Crisis Intervention, if it's harassment, not physical assault, there's no evidence, what would you say to people that are afraid to come forward?
Still do with whatever information you can. If you're comfortable with doing that, if you feel safe doing that, again, it's putting the power back on the person who's been assaulted or harassed. You want to put them in a place where they are in control and they are in charge. First of all, like, let's say you had a friend, she was assaulted, you said you have to call, and you called Rape Crisis. I would not talk to your friend unless I heard her say she wants to talk to me, because I can't force that on her or him. They need to be able to come to us. But no matter what, if you've been sexually, even getting back to Heather and Bernie, asking what are our
your services?
What are our services for Rape Crisis? You can come to us. You can be sexually assaulted, harassed, whatever. You could be 30, 40, 50 years ago. It doesn't matter. And you can come to us for free counseling. If it's something that's newer and you do need to go to court, let's say you are being called to court, we can accompany you to your court dates and just be there with you, be a support service for you.
You help with like restraining orders, things like that?
We don't help with the restraining orders. There are other agencies that will help with that, and we can also put them in contact with resources that will. Victim Witness can also help them with that kind of stuff. Those kinds of things. But the things that we do is more of a counseling and the support, and also not just for the person who's been assaulted, but for their significant other. And when I say significant other, that doesn't mean their partner. It can be a mom, it can be a dad, it can be a roommate, a friend, somebody who can help, because they don't know how to deal with this person. Now this person's going to be, all of a sudden they may be triggered and they don't know what to do for their friend. So we also offer counseling for the friends as well, like a significant other.
Because that support is really important.
It is. It's going to be super
Whether
important.
It's coworkers or family.
Yes. Yeah. Yeah. It's really important that they start putting together a support group.
Here's a question: what kind of injury do I have to have before I have a legal claim?
And I'm assuming they're meaning
I would say
criminally.
that was assault. Yeah, I would say that this is a criminal.
And we've been kind of talking within the sexual assault context, but typically for assault, you don't have to have an actual physical injury. You can have an assault without injury and it still be a crime. So I don't know exactly how much.
You can have an assault without an injury because it wasn't a hard enough.
Well, you can hit someone without it causing an injury. And you could commit a sexual assault. We'll see rapes where there's, say, choking or something, where you won't necessarily see any injury, but the assault has still occurred.
So you don't have to have a particular kind of injury. So how can we answer this question? What determines whether you have a legal case or not in terms of an assault? What would the circumstances be?
Well,
it's difficult, huh?
Well, the question is, we're talking, there's all kinds of different assaults. So, and we've been talking within the sexual assault context.
Is it just as simple as I said no and they didn't
Stop.
respect that?
Yeah, and you can have a sexual assault without any injury. I mean, you can commit a rape without using, say, assaulting someone, striking them. You can use just force. Say, if you don't have sex with me, I'm gonna, injure this.
threat.
Exactly, by threat, duress, intoxication. I mean, you could intoxicate someone and then rape them where they wouldn't necessarily have any injuries, but that is still a rape.
Let's go back to the workplace. So here's Richard in Shasta Lake, who asks, if I accuse a person of being a brown noser and kissing up to the boss, is that considered sexual harassment?
No, that is not sexual harassment, because now, depending on the language that's used when you're talking about someone like that, could it be possibly creating a hostile work environment for someone? Just saying those kinds of words, no. That doesn't cross the line into sexual harassment. But there's a whole other word we have not talked about yet, and that's bullying or abusive conduct in the workplace. And there's when words like that get used, of a brown noser or any number of other words that get used, well, that can fall into this category.
Is it a different policy?
Yes, it is. So abusive conduct or bullying or professional conduct in the workplace. In the HR world, we speak of it that way, kind of professional conduct. But California has not outlawed bullying in the workplace. But what California has done is said, in your sexual harassment training, employers, you now must include discussions around that identifies bullying behaviors. So when we talk about those kinds of things that he just mentioned, that can cross the line. Okay, it's not based on that person's sex, but it's simply because I don't like who they are. And then I'm going to gossip, I'm going to use inappropriate words, I'm going to be maybe use threatening words, demeaning, humiliating, embarrassing. Well, that falls into this line of bullying or abusive conduct. The state of California says we're not making it illegal, but employers, you better be aware that you're training it and you have a policy in place. So that's the other side of employment law. It stretches beyond just sexual harassment.
So where is that line between bullying and this?
So
That's just
without getting
interesting that it's not illegal.
Without too far into the detail, sexual harassment has to be based on that category, your sex. You're being treated differently because of your gender. Where bullying is not related to a protected status or class, the Civil Rights Act of 1964 identifies protected status and class. Well, bullying or abusive conduct says it doesn't make any difference who you are, what you are, race, ethnicity, gender, any of that, but it's just inappropriate behavior in the workplace. So we don't make it illegal in California. Some states do. Now, in K through 12 schools, bullying is not legal. It's illegal in California, but in the workplace, it's not. So we still have policies we have to train on, hold people accountable to the behavior, but it's not illegal. So it doesn't fall into the criminal side of it.
Interesting. And here is a question. If I am being harassed because I am transgender, is that illegal?
Yes. In the state of California, absolutely. Federal law, it's kind of mixed at federal law around gender identification and transgender. I would never rely on federal law, but state of California very specifically says you cannot discriminate or harass transgender individuals. So law in California is very clear.
So if they're transgender for some other reason, they're being sexually harassed in an illegal way, do they go to the district attorney's office? Do they find themselves a private civil attorney? Do they have, if it happens at work, they must have some kind of agency to go to, maybe not an attorney. So
So-
who do people go to?
So in the workplace, it's really the exact same question. The law doesn't differentiate whether it's male, female, transgender, doesn't make any difference. Is you follow your reporting procedure, because all employers have to have the policy that protects all of those categories. So you follow the same procedure. If the employer does not respond, then you call the state of California, the Department of Fair Employment and Housing, and they will take the report. So it's the civil side of it, not the criminal side.
So if the company finds no fault, Jay from Reading asks, can you sue civilly? This reminds me of this PBS coverage of the U.S. Forest Service, because in that story, in some cases, investigations were done, but say somebody wasn't found at fault. Do people have the ability to go on beyond that?
So in the employment side of it, if the employer says, we don't know, and I'm still going to challenge the employer saying, I don't think you did a good investigation if you said you don't know. However, if that is a result, then yes, the employee can go to an attorney and go look at the civil side of it. The employee can go to the state of California, can go to the federal government and see if they will take that case on and move it forward. So there is still, just because the employer says no, there is still opportunity to move forward.
We have someone who's asked, my experience over many years, it's usually the owner of the company that threatens you with being fired. What is there to do?
So it doesn't make any difference who the person is that is doing the harassment
This one,
or
does
the
the
behavior.
harasser have to be a boss? No.
No, does not have to be a boss. Not in California, it's very clear. It can be a coworker.
Interesting. So this question from Reading, I thought a comment was made that private industries come farther in their awareness of sexual harassment than the public sector. If so, why do you think that is?
So
Have we
that's
come farther?
probably to me. So my experience has been, and again, it's a lot of years of doing this. Private sector employers first had more liability early on in this whole awareness and the training and the responsibility. We also have to remember that when Assembly Bill 1825 in California that requires sexual harassment, not all sexual harassment training, public sector was exempt for a few years. Well, that's no longer true. Public sector employees have to go through the training. So what I see is the private sector has been ahead of it for quite a while, and public sector is catching up. Having worked in both worlds, soon 5 years in public sector. So public sector is catching up. Doesn't mean that either side is anywhere close to perfect, because we still have issues. And one claim or one case of sexual harassment or hostile work environment is one too many, no matter what.
Have you seen any changes, any of you, since this Me Too movement has started?
Yes,
Getting
yeah,
more calls?
more awareness, I think, and that's huge.
More awareness, I would agree.
Any changes at the DA's office?
I think we're starting to see more people willing to come forward and report.
It's going to take a little time to trickle.
Yeah.
I mean, to see the domino effect.
That's why I was wondering
Yeah.
if you guys had
Yeah.
seen any
Yeah.
change
I think
at
it's
all, 'cause
starting.
It's very
I think it's
new.
starting.
This is very.
I think what we're seeing is men stopping and thinking for a moment. And I think, well, they should, because again, men are 88% of the problem here. So the movement, I see it as nothing but good for workplace relationships. Public sector, private sector, armed forces doesn't make any difference. You know, it will help in the long run.
You know, we talked a bit about, you know, what might happen if you go through the investigation starts at the hospital or such. But if someone goes to the police, how does that differ? Is there a different?
No.
Same thing. They'll
Yeah,
get them to the hospital if
Yeah,
that's what they want to
and
do.
then law enforcement's going to get involved. And they're going to get a statement from the victim. They'll collect physical evidence if
They call
they
a rape
can.
crisis, and we'll go down there and be with them if that's what they want.
Yeah, almost
Yeah.
any jurisdiction's going to have a protocol. And once the report's made, they're going to contact all the necessary people who are part of that team to respond and investigate.
Well,
it.
this is good that we are educating each other and our kids and others on what these terms are and what consent is and what it isn't, and these issues of respect and boundaries. We have a question that came in about warning signs. I think it's an interesting question. Are there any warning signs that could appear early on in a relationship that would signal that someone may eventually turn violent? Is there something we can see ahead of time in
A specific,
And be
that's
warned.
going to be hard. It's actually easier to see things
hindsight?
yes,
Yeah,
when it's
of
already
course.
happened, then you realize, oh, this person, okay, what I'm seeing a lot of right now is using what do they call it, Tinder? One of those dating sites and things like that. I'm seeing a lot of people become victims on those sites where they meet somebody and they start talking to somebody they don't really know. And what happens is this person grooms them and asks them questions like, oh, are you alone today? Are you at work? Are you with your, they start profiling you and get your schedule, and they know when they are safe to do what they want to do to you.
So that leads us to this other question. How much of sexual assault and harassment, how much does it have to do with attraction, and how much does it have to do with power? What are these deeper issues?
It's all power. It's all power.
Power.
And if they say there's any attraction involved, it's them using their power because of their attraction.
Yeah,
to
I
you.
would agree.
It's
Interesting. Well, maybe you could tell us how businesses can get a hold of Trindle Insurance, because you guys have been experts in this in Northern California for many years in multiple counties. How do they find you? In Trinity County, right?
So
in Weaverville?
in Trinity County, in Weaverville. Now, we are a member association, but certainly they can contact us on our website, www.trindle.org. And if there's questions, I can certainly help refer to a direction of where they might go.
I bet you could. You've been doing this a lot
I've been doing this a long
in
time.
this area. Well, thank you, and thank you for being here. Eric Hereford is Trinity County District Attorney. I don't know if he drove with Randy from Weaverville over Buckhorn tonight, but
May ride back with him.
it's a snowy night, so be careful on the road. But Eric, do you have anything you want to add about victim services or anything? We just have a very short amount of
Just
time.
real briefly, so people know, once we file a case, we have victim witness support people within our office and can provide services. We can line up state funding for counseling, relocation, a lot of services. So people should know there's a lot of support out there.
And also with us, Julie Hunter from Rape Crisis Intervention and Prevention. You want to shoot out a phone number there, or a way to contact you?
342-RAPE, 342-7273. We are available 24/7.
Thank you so much. This is North State Issues. We appreciate you joining us this evening, and we hope that you got a lot out of this show. It was certainly a quick hour, lots of great information, and hopefully you can share what you learned with others. This is KIXE TV, your PBS station, and we appreciate you spending your evening with us, learning about sexual assault and harassment and what you can do about it and how to support others. Thank you.